Well, first, thank you all for coming today. I know it wasn't for the food, right? It was for something else. And thank Dr. Ahmad Farouk Musa and the Islamic Renaissance Front for inviting me. I want to reassure the audience that I'm not here to talk about camel urine or fly wings, and I'm really not here to talk about decline of any civilization. As somebody coming from the US, given the last election, I wouldn't have any business to talk about decline. Decline seems to be everywhere. But having said that, when I got this invitation and I saw this kind of benign title, kind of a loaded title, as I'm sure all of you know, I thought it kind of begged to be reframed. Any kind of answer you give is going to be a bad answer to a question is what is wrong with. And as an outsider to Malaysia and as a non-Muslim, I'm here not to give a khutbah, but rather to give a kind of professional academic talk about Salafism. And I think the issue of Salafism is relevant, I think, to most people. I know it's been talked about here in this region for a long time. And I think it's been talked about in some ways because and I'm hoping people could see that. I apologize in the back. I know this might probably seem very small, but I'll be reading some of it, so that might be clarified. What I'd like to do is try to reframe the question, what is wrong with Islam now, to why has Salafism emerged as such a dominant trend in Muslim societies and beyond? Or why now, after the seeming success of Muslim reformers in the 19th and 20th centuries and signs of economic growth, have Muslims become attracted to Salafi ideas and practices? What is to be done? I think that's kind of the question behind the question that Dr. Ahmad Farouk asked, because he wanted us to focus, I think, on Salafism. And I think it is particularly relevant, and maybe I want to start by using a quote of sorts from a book written recently by a now deceased scholar. It's actually a tragedy to modern Muslim thought that the man is no longer with us. This is a quote from Shahab Ahmad in his book, What is Islam? And he was talking about Salafism here, and he was talking about it in its modern kind of context. As we all know, Salafism has a very, very long history. The notion of pious ancestry or pious ancestors goes back a very long time. But it's really the kind of the modern context where people start worrying about things. I want to talk about why that is. But his quote is this, talking about Salafism: "It represents precisely an attempt by modern Muslims to uncomplicate human and historical Islam by relocating Islam to a moment before Muslims had the opportunity to complicate it with their various and contradictory attempts at meaning-making down the centuries." And the book, What is Islam, is actually a celebration of the variety and the contradictory elements of Islam, in order to try to show that Islam in its richness is actually what makes Islam so attractive. And of course, people are reacting to Salafism in a way mainly because of the images that we get all the time in the news. And I don't have to go through these. In some ways, you've seen them before, and the horrendous acts of violence that have been carried out in the name of Islam. And a lot of scholars have reacted to this, and the online material speaking out against jihadi Salafis and Salafis in general, the outpouring of this in the last decade has been amazing, actually. A few years ago, Khalid Abu Fadl, the Egyptian-American author, scholar, wrote a book called The Great Theft: Wresting Islam from the Extremists, and he wrote the book in order to try to essentially counter Salafism in the Western Muslim community and beyond, and to try to talk Muslims out of following this direction. And in some ways, there's a bit of a problematic, at least in my view, with his assessment here, because he does what happens a lot of time online when anybody talks about Salafism. Oh, I'm sorry, am I going backwards here? Oh, and there's a kind of linkage of Salafism with the Khawarij, with the Wahhabis, and there's this kind of glomming together of a variety of sects, both early and modern and making it seem like they're all one thing. I mean, this is a bit of the rhetoric that's out there, and it's out there for a reason, in some ways to counter jihadi Salafis and to counter the violence. But there's some difficulties with this, because when you use the word Salafi, the question is, whose Salafi are you talking about? The modern Salafism, I mean, it was not uncommon. Number one, I mean, we go back to the origins of Ibn Taymiyyah, there's Abdul Wahhab, al-Afghani was associated with the Salafis, so was Muhammad Abdu, Hassan al-Banna, and then our now on the run current caliph is also known as a Salafi. So and the question is, I mean, whose Salafism are we really talking about? And it just becomes this blurred thing. And there's no way that Khalid Abu Fadl or the criticisms that have been directed against Salafism would be directed against al-Afghani or Muhammad Abdu, or I would also say not even Hassan al-Banna. So, and part of the confusion with this, I believe anyway, is that we have a great transformation that has occurred that has shifted kind of from a Salafi-oriented reformers that we saw in the later part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th, in the Middle East in particular, and much of this has transferred around the Muslim world, to a kind of school of Islamic thought, at least that's what many Salafis like to think, is that there is actually a school of Salafism. I prefer to think of Salafism as a kind of global religious movement with a lot of varieties, and it has settled into modern Muslim countries, different Muslim countries, in different ways. I'm going to try to talk about what that phenomenon is, and then at the end I will try to talk about how I believe it has settled here in Malaysia, because it is certainly here, and I think that's the major concern. But let me just say from the outset is that I don't think there is much to do about Salafism. I think it's a reality of the Muslim world. It's going to be the reality of the Muslim world for a very, very long time. And I don't mean the radical jihadi version. I just mean Salafism in its other variations. It's here because it answers a set of questions, and it answers a set of complications and addresses a number of complications for how Muslims are living in the Muslim world. And you see people in search of meaning to try to sort out the complications of living in a modern, postmodern world. People are doing this in the West, they're doing this in Muslim societies, and Salafism offers one possibility for this. And given the fact that modernity, post-modernity isn't going anywhere, I don't think Salafism is either. So, let me just say that I think the modern form that we're talking about of Salafism has two major contributing factors, and that is Wahhabism, Wahhabism in both its original and in its modern Saudi formation of Wahhabism, and Islamism. And this, without going through the entire history of this morphs in the 50s, 60s, well, primarily the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s in Saudi Arabia, once the Muslim Brotherhood takes up shop there as a result of the oppression in Egypt under Nasser. They're invited into Saudi Arabia. Many of the very people that we know are part of the jihadi Salafi faction now were trained by Muslim brothers in Saudi Arabia who were there at the invitation of the Saudis. By the way, you need almost a scorecard to try to keep track of the various ways in which Saudi Arabia has affiliated itself with the Muslim Brotherhood and is now denouncing them. The logic of some of this is just amazing, and how this is shape-shifted over the years. But originally, early on, the Saudis and the Muslim Brotherhood were on very good terms, which is why, and they even thought that they were on such good terms that they should be teaching young Saudis about Islam. But of course, they weren't just teaching about Islam, they were teaching about Islamism. They were teaching about a politicized form of Islam. And this wound up over time, of course, coming back to bite the Saudis, which they very much regretted, which is one of the reasons we're seeing now the kind of backlash against them. But let me just talk about this for a while from the kind of Saudi, the Wahhabi viewpoint of this, because for al-Wahhab, the prevalence of deviance fit into a kind of pattern of historical decline, one that both resonated with and recapitulated the developments outlined and condemned by Ibn Hanbal and Ibn Taymiyyah. So this is going back to the very notion of the pious ancestor, which I believe is more of a trope or a symbolic catch-all than anything else. But what he does, more accurately, al-Wahhab evoked a kind of, he established a pattern of decline from early history to create a moral cause for action and a ready-made role for himself as the renewer of the faith. This is something that's easily done. It's almost like it's a pre-packaged thing, that you can evoke this, and if you can convince people of it, and you can convince people that you know the answers, it's quite effective, and it's not the last time it's going to be used. The pattern itself is rather simplistic, and that is it entailed an elaboration of dangerous innovation, the bid'ah, naming those responsible for the decline, and providing a means of restoring the truth. Again, this is a kind of pattern response to a time in history. We saw it, we see it in other places, and this is what Wahhab was playing on. He essentially reawakened something to use it for his own purposes, and it was quite effective. And Islamism, I think it just goes to kind of link these two up, was really a religiously based identity politics that took religion seriously, unlike secular nationalism in a place like Egypt, and called for the establishment of institutions that would shape both public and private life. For al-Banna, the Salafi ideal was de rigueur reformism. I mean, this was not the Salafism that we see today. This was just calling on the very notion of reforming. Everybody wants to be a reformer at this period of time. He characterized the Brotherhood as a Salafi message, a Sunni way, a Sufi truth, a political organization, an athletic group, a cultural educational union, an economic company, and a social ideal, which is another way of saying he tried to pass off the Brotherhood as a modern state. It was everything. It was all-encompassing. And this is the very message that's brought also to Saudi Arabia, that it can be politicized, that Islamism, and then when it's linked with Salafism, it can be politicized. Out of this kind of historical fusion emerges three various strands that we know today exist of Salafism. The kind of purist, quietists. Again, by quietists, I mean they're not necessarily involved with politics. They exist in public life. They're very visible in public life, but they're not involved with politics. And then what is sometimes referred to as the politicos, the electoral Salafis, which is in some ways a contradiction in terms, because at one point in time, Salafis would have never been involved with politics. But they become involved with politics depending on the nation-state context that they happen to be operating in. So we see these people operating this way in Egypt, for example, because of transformations that happened. When I think of when I first started going to Egypt back in the 80s, no one was talking about Salafis. Everyone was talking about Islamists. No one even thought about the Salafis. You know, fast forward to, 30 years after this, and now the Islamists are in jail or on the run, and the Salafis have a political party. In some ways, this makes no sense, but this is the trend. What really goes to show is how both Islamists and Salafists are really, they might have abstract universal ideals, but these are always grounded in particular realities, and individuals who are Islamists or Salafis always try to use those contexts to try to promote their own ideas in whatever ways they can. And when the politics sometimes open up, people will get involved with the politics, despite the fact, for example, with Hassan al-Banna, that he denounced modern politics. He denounced nationalism. He denounced political parties. The Salafis themselves would critique people. And even, by the way, these three groups that exist now, the purist Salafis now denounce their fellow politico Salafis, and the radical, I mean, they're all at each other because they think they have the wrong Salafist message. So, and what might be helpful here is just to at least talk about a kind of baseline of Salafism of these three, because of the three, it's clear the purists have what, I mean, all of them are purist in the sense of their operational behavior. So there's a kind of a strict enforcement or adherence to and enforcement of the creed, Tawheed. Islam viewed as a kind of totalizing force, the manhaj, and the adoption of distinctive dress and comportment. Attempts to avoid intellectual and social contamination, the idea of being very, very pure. Rejection of deviant Muslims, and yes, I'm putting deviant here in quotes. It's all a matter of your perspective of who happens to be deviant. Obviously, the Shia are deviant, at least from the perspective here, as are Sufis deviant, as are, of course, Dr. Liberal Muslims deviant. But including fellow Salafis are deviant, to the point, of course, of calling, of using the takfir, the notion of excommunication of sorts. And then there is also a distinctive antagonism towards Christians, Jews, and the West. These are some of the baseline ideas that you can find in lots of Salafi writings, whether they're purists, politicos, or whether they're jihadis. You can find it throughout. Just a shift. Because we're talking about a particular point in time in history, okay, when this is happening. This is not the reformist Salafism of the early part of the 19th century into the 20th century. This is a Salafism that has essentially been formed and been created and recreated in a point in time, I would say, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, as a slow growth thing. And it has emerged not just because of events that are happening in one place, but because of global events that I think are happening, which is what makes it such a global movement. And for me, the kind of underlying structural realities that inform this are kind of the globalization of culture and economy, which, by the way, Salafis are a part of, entrenched authoritarian politics in Muslim-majority countries especially, lack of jobs and economic opportunities, widespread corruption and crony capitalism, limited civil society, discontent with the unfulfilled promises of post-colonial leaders, and the diffusion and dissipation of religious authority. Everyone now is a religious authority, right? I mean, it doesn't take anything to be a religious authority. I just got done doing some research in Egypt on self-help books and the way in which Muslim thinkers are starting to write self-help books, sometimes from a Muslim perspective, sometimes not. And the people who feel that they can do this, there's actually a rather famous man who's written 3 books right now, who's a dentist by training, who's now writing self-help books. I mean, people become authorities about everything, and not surprisingly, the global culture and the spread of technology makes this possible, because online you can do and be just about anything you want. Okay, so what I think we essentially have now is a kind of new era and a new form of Muslim religiosity that's existing alongside of and within the kind of other various forms of religiosity that we can find in the Muslim world. And what it's doing is it has an expression of discontent with promises of both modern ideologies, nationalism, Arabism, and Islamism, all which seem to have failed in some way, and development schemes of capitalism, socialism, which one could argue have in some ways, even in their success, failed in some ways. And I think it's really kind of a pushback against modernity itself. It's a frustration with modernity and the shape that it has taken, the direction that it's taken. And by the way, not just for Muslims. Now, we can see the visual elements of this because remember, so this lands in different places in different ways. And I want to emphasize this. In Egypt, probably one of the places where I know best for doing research there, Salafism is not a big deal. Now, granted, jihadi Salafism is a big deal. It's a big deal everywhere. But Salafism is just part of the landscape of what it means to be Muslim in Egypt. So you can find Salafis everywhere, on the streets, in the military, in the police force, right? They exist everywhere, and it's not that it's not that everyone agrees with that as a lifestyle or their beliefs, but they are part and parcel of the Egyptian society, right? And while there are some ways in which they stand out, here's an example of the Noor Party in Egypt, which currently has some seats. What you see on the left is one of their posters for an election. So you see the photographs of the various figures. You'll see that the one photograph with a rose on it is really representing a woman, since they didn't want to show her face. By the way, they got a lot of heat for this. But they are now in the parliament. They're now there. And they're making their voices known. And by the way, I think this can be they're there now, and they have strength at least. By the way, in the election that happened post-Arab Spring, they came in second after the Muslim Brotherhood Party. Incredibly good showing, very, very good showing. But I would say that their existence now in Egypt is just as tenuous as every other political party's existence in Egypt is tenuous right now, because going against the current order, going against the current ruling party, can end you up in jail very easily. It doesn't matter who you are. And as you know, if you follow any of this stuff, ISSI is doing a great job of preempting any kind of opposition by jailing them before they can even run in the election. So in some ways, the Salafis have benefited from the decline of the Muslim Brotherhood and the fact that they're in jail or on the run. But the Salafis are only there in the public square and in the politics because they are not going after the ruling government. And so it's a kind of tenuous arrangement which could fall apart. And of course, there are lots of Salafis, by the way, in Europe. This is very disconcerting to European populations in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany. They clearly stand out. And they draw attention to other Muslim populations in Europe and create some very awkward and uncomfortable situations there. But their presence there is very clear. And they're reacting not necessarily to the same set of political, social, economic factors that are happening in Muslim societies, but they're reacting to situations in Europe. And the pushback of European dominant societies against what they take to be outsiders coming in and changing the very contours of life in Europe. And Salafis are in some sense, kind of living off the antagonism. Because many of them are, if you've seen some of the video clips of especially the male groups walking in groups, it almost makes it seem like they're a gang because they're often very, very aggressive, because they're trying to push back against what they see as the oppression. So I'm going to kind of transfer here and end on the situation of Malaysia, because clearly Salafism has landed here, and I'm sure we can have this conversation in the other ways that it has. And you can see signs of it in this country. There's no way to stop it in some ways, because we could debate the politics of how open Malaysian society is, but people from the Middle East and other places are coming here. Malaysian students are going elsewhere and coming back, getting a lot of ideas about what is correct Islam. Lots of debates that occur all the time about this. So this is a hot button issue in Malaysia because of that. But I think there's particular reasons why Salafism has landed where it has, not just in the public in the sense that individuals who might opt for a kind of Salafi lifestyle or Salafi ideas, but there's other things going on also. It either helps or hurts, depending on your perspective, that Malaysia hosts a particular figure who just loves to ratchet up the attention and just loves to provoke. His provocation is a bit different than yours, Dr. Farouk. But he loves to provoke, so much so that you know that he can't go back to his native India right now, or he doesn't want to go back to his native India. I didn't even realize that he had gained PR status here. It's kind of amazing that he has. But he certainly has a message, and it certainly resonates, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, because he is actually expressing many of the very purest ideas that create antagonism in societies. And of course, that's his whole point, is to do that. because the identity of Salafism, especially in a modern context, whether it's in a Muslim majority society or in the West, is rooted in difference. Difference between who is a good Muslim, a real Muslim, and who isn't. So the antagonism is not just with outsiders, the religious other, it's with Muslims themselves. It's within the Muslim community, and it's a contestation within that, and they're feeding off this. And I don't have to tell you that there's also some political aspects to this, where Salafis have become part and parcel of the government and have been affiliated with the ruling government here. By the way, I should say, I do not believe that there is a natural fit here in terms of actual agreement on beliefs. But what there is, I believe, a kind of natural symbiosis between some of the cultural politics that has been practiced in Malaysia since the Islamic resurgence and beyond, and what the Salafi message happens to be. And it's an unfortunate convergence that some people are capitalizing on, and I think it has some dangerous implications. So, what are those? I would say that the history of this has to do with the hyped up Islamic identity that comes out of the Islamic resurgence, the period of the Islamic resurgence, a kind of Malay Muslim religious observance and the kind of ratcheting up of that, and exclusivism that emerged in the Malay Muslim community, their own version of purity without Salafi influence, one could argue, that this emerges out of the Islamic resurgence. UMNO dominance and political opportunism. We don't want to underestimate UMNO. And of course, the Saudi dawah and charitable activity, which one could put in parens, could be regarded as propaganda, or it's just the Saudi way of spreading its message. So, I think the Salafi ideals and the symbols in Malaysia, I think these things come together for several reasons. And they're powerful and they're desired for several reasons. One is, the Salafi ideals and symbols in Malaysia denigrate and intimidate the religious other. Now, this is not something, personally, that I believe that Malaysians as a whole believe in, but it's something that happens, and it's something that's out there in the public, and everyone knows it's there, and no one likes to talk about it, but it's there. But what these Salafi ideals do also is they reaffirm Malay Muslim purity and exclusivism. It reaffirms something that was happening on its own as a result of the Islamic resurgence. And the result of this, because the politicization of it, is that it strengthens UMNO's base. Now, I don't have any predictions here for this, but it shouldn't be surprising that somebody who's playing a kind of dangerous card of using Salafism for political purposes to kind of bring out the vote creates potentials for other things. Creates a potential, at least on a basic level, for a kind of unlivable social situation where people who are not part of the majority feel that they are not part of the society, they're not part of the nation itself. Now, from a Salafi perspective, that might be the very point. I don't think that's the perspective necessarily of UMNO in general, at all, but it winds up being something that's communicated in very subtle and in sometimes not too subtle ways as a result of what I think is this kind of natural symbiosis that has occurred. It is not again, this is a particular way in which, again, that Salafism has kind of taken root here because of other things that are happening in Malaysian society have partially to do with Salafism itself and its global spread, but have everything to do with the way in which the politics operates here. And just like Islamism situates itself according to the politics in different places, so has Salafism adapted, and I think that's one of the ways it's adapted here. And with that, I will turn it over.